Good afternoon again, my GMT20240725 student. So I've completed the first critical chapter of the studies of macroeconomics. That is a chapter on GDP, how we measure the total value of production in an economy like the United States. So I'm going to go to another interesting topic, which is a topic of economic growth and the wealth of nations. So in that chapter, we're going to learn a lot about how countries grow, what are the key ingredients that will make a country attain a higher living standard in terms of economic prosperity. So let me share my screen, and then we'll talk about it on the other side. So here is going to be chapter 27, which is a chapter on the wealth of nations and economic growth. So here's going to be outline what I'm going to be talking about. It's a fairly short chapter. It shouldn't take us that long. So we shall talk about the key facts about the wealth of nations and economic growth. Okay, how countries accumulate wealth over time. What are the key ingredients that lead to their wealth accumulation? And then we'll also talk about the understanding the wealth of nation and then the role of incentives and institutions. Okay, so the key introduction here, economic growth brings wealth, because we talked about it the other time in the previous chapter, that economic growth is when a country's production capability has been expanded. It's basically the percentage increase in what? In GDP. If the country can produce increasing amount of GDP, then we say that the economy is experiencing economic growth. So, so economic growth is going to bring wealth, which increases societal well-being. Wealthier nations have higher infant survival rates. They have higher life expectancy and nutrition. They have more educational opportunities, more leisure and entertainment, fewer conflicts such as civil wars and riots, and more material goods. So those are the key characteristics of countries like mostly Western countries in Western Europe, the United States, Canada, and countries on the Pacific Rim like Japan, Australia, New Zealand. Okay. So let's put this kind of in a little bit in a map here, showing you the relationship between infant survival rate. And so this is basically what we call the infant mortality, the percentage or the number of kids who die before reaching the age of what? Age of 5 per 1,000 of live birth. So you can see that countries like Liberia, for example, in Liberia, close to 800 children are dying. That's the infant mortality rate. So the infant survival rate per 1,000. So 800 children survive in countries like Liberia. That means 200 out of the 1,000 born babies are going to die before reaching the age of what? The age of 5. Look at a country like North Korea, close to about 960 survival rate. That means about 40 kids in North Korea die before reaching the age of what? The age of 5. But when you look at wealthier nations like the United States up there, you can see that, because the average income, GDP per capita in real dollars, about close to 50,000 there for the US. You can see that the number of kids who are surviving for every 1,000 born babies is close to like 992 somewhere there. So that basically means only about 8 kids in the United States will die before reaching the age of what? The age of 5 for every 1,000 newborns. So this clearly shows that there's a clear-cut positive relationship between economic prosperity, countries with higher average income, GDP per capita, and infant survival rates. Okay. So let's talk about some of the key facts about the wealth of nations and economic growth itself. We're going to find that GDP per capita varies enormously among nations. There's big disparity. Everyone used to be poor. When we go back to periods before Christ, when we still didn't have modern civilization that we have today, almost there are growth. So there was almost no economic growth in the entire world. up to around the period of what industrial revolution that started in Great Britain in 1750. So we'll talk about that. Then so everyone used to be poor. I'm going to show you the graph shortly. So there are growth miracles and growth disasters. What do I mean by growth miracles? There are countries that have exploded in economic growth and attained higher living standard in a short period of time. We call them growth miracles, like countries like in Asia, like Taiwan, Singapore. Okay, those are some of the growth miracles that we see today. And then we also have growth disasters, countries that started off as wealthy countries, nations, but have since regressed to be poor. A classic example is Argentina, countries Nigeria. Okay, so I'm going to show you some of the interesting numbers in a few minutes here. So most of the world's population is poor relative to the United States. That's a fact. About 1 billion people have incomes of less than $3 per day. That is a fact. About 70% of the world's population lives in countries with a GDP per capita equal to or less than 12,472. So that's the average income for the entire year long, okay, which is about the level in China today. And about 73% of the world's population lives in countries with a GDP per capita less than the average. The average GDP per capita was 14,517 in 2014. Okay. So let's look at around 70% of the world's population lives in a country with an annual GDP per capita of less than the world average. You can see clearly here, you can see that countries like a lot of countries, like Liberia, the average income there is about $1,000. Can you believe that the average Liberian makes about $1,000 the entire year long? Country like Nigeria, which is one of the oil-rich countries in Africa, the average income in Nigeria is not even $5,000. It's about $4,000, $3,500. So this is really despicable when you think about it. And then you see countries like the rich, some of the rich countries like Luxembourg, the United States, see, very high income. Italy, okay. Argentina is about 20,000, but Argentina used to be one among the richest countries when we went back in time, like in the 1970s. But it has since regressed to become more like an average country. The standard of living in Argentina in 1960s was about the same standard of living in terms of average income like Canada. In other words, the average income of Canadians were about the same as Argentina in 1960s. But because Argentina made some bad choices, Argentina regressed while Canada continued marching forward. In that today, you cannot compare the two countries. Canadian income is way higher than Argentina, and yet they used to be at the same level of economic development in the 1960s. So this is also a learning lesson that while you are wealthy and rich, that wealth does not guarantee you that you're going to prosper forever. If your country makes bad choices, your country could also regress from being prospered to being poor. So let's talk about this. Everyone used to be poor. The distribution of world income tells us that poverty is normal while wealth is unusual. GDP per capita in year one is estimated around $700 to $1,000 per year in 2015 dollars. In year one of the first year, this was approximately the same in all major regions of the world. Everybody was about the same, was poor. For most of recorded human history, there was no long-run economic growth until I told you around the period of Industrial Revolution that started in England. Today, the GDP per capita is 50 times larger in the richest countries than in the poorest countries. And yet in year one, everybody was poor. We're about the same level. But then some countries took off, others remain poor. So this is the situation that we have. So you can see from year one, every country in the world was poor. Until around 1500, when you can see there's we start to having some countries started breaking away from others, like the United States, Western Europe. Meanwhile, other countries remain completely the same way they were in like year 1000. Most countries in Africa, even China, until around 1900. So around 1900, you can see that Latin America and China started to break away. Latin America and former USSR like Russia, and China followed suit later in the 1960s, 1970s. But and India also breaking away. But the countries that is left poor is Africa. Okay, kind of like did not see income increasing almost at all. So economic growth is measured as a growth rate of real GDP per capita. So even slow growth, even if you're growing at, what I mean by slow growth, if you're growing at only 1%, 2% per year, if you can sustain that growth every year, you don't regress, that can have meaningful impact on average incomes. The United States, by the way, does not grow at a fast rate, but the US has been able to sustain that low growth for a long period of time. That's what has made us prosperous, because it's one thing to grow at 15% one year, and then next year you grow at negative 20%. You don't want that. You want it, so it might be good to sustain, no matter how low your economic growth is. If you can sustain that 2-3% every year for a long period of time, that can mean a lot in terms of rising standard of living. And then growth builds up. Okay, so economic growth, even slow growth, sustainable long-term, produce big difference. So if growth slows, builds on top of growth through compounding or exponential growth. So here's a formula that you can use to calculating economic growth. So YT there is what is your real GDP per capita at time T. Time T means today. So if I'm comparing the value of GDP today, and T minus 1 means yesterday, it means a period before today, which is maybe last year. So if I know that the GDP, real GDP per capita in yesterday or last year, and the GDP per capita today, then G, which is growth, economic growth, T, is basically a percentage change in the what? Real GDP per capita. So I'm going to tell you, again, the formula for percentage change we saw in the previous chapter. You take the value of what? GDP per capita today minus the value of GDP per capita yesterday or last year, divided by the value of real GDP per capita yesterday, then multiply by 100. Okay, that's just a simple formula. For example, if you're looking at to calculate how you calculate economic growth between 2008 and 2009, in 2008, the real GDP per capita was 15,000. Real GDP per capita was 15,000. And then 2009 was maybe 15,500. So to calculate the growth rate between 2009 and 2008, you're going to take the value of real GDP per capita in 2009 minus the value of real GDP per capita in 2008 divided by the value in 2008 times 100. So that means the average income would have grown by 3.3% from 2008 to 2009. So it's a very simple way to understand it. So if real GDP per capita was $22,000 in year one and $23,000 in year two could be the following year. Then to calculate economic growth, you just say economic growth would be equals to, you take real GDP per capita in year two minus real GDP per capita in year one, the previous year, and then you divide these numbers by real GDP in year one. And then you multiply this by what? 100. So in this case, the economy would have grown by, you take $23,000 for year three. So $23,000 minus $22,000 divide by $22,000 times 100. So the numerator is going to be, so G is going to be equal, so numerator is going to be 1,000 in dollars divided by $22,000. So divide by $22,000 So the dollar sign cancel, then you multiply this by 100 because it has to be in percentage. You can see, so this 1/22 divided by 1,000. So let's check what the number is. My calculator here on my phone. So it's 1 divided by 22 times 100. So that means economy G is going to be equal to 4.1, 4.5%. Again, or 4.55% if you round it to 2 decimal points. Yeah. So that's how we calculate that. So you see that it's 4.55%. So there's another rule. There's another way that economists they want to look at how the value of an economic or of any variable doubles. Like for example, if I say the average income is in a country is $22,000, then how long does it take that income to double from $22,000 to $44,000? What I mean by doubling. So there's a rule that growth economists have come up with. We call it the rule of 70. It's basically an approximation. It approximates the length of time necessary for a growing variable to double. So the number of time it takes an economic variable, be it income, be it money in your savings account, you just take 70 divided by the growth rate in that variable. For example, if average income is growing at 3.5%, with real GDP per capita is growing at 3.5%, then according to the rule of 70, it will take 70 divided by the growth rate, 3.5. So it will take 20 years for that income to double. So if we knew that income was let's say the income was $22,000 today, then it would take 20 years for that income to double to $44,000 if the average growth rate was 3.5%. And you can apply this not only for average income, but to any money in your savings account, how much it takes to double. So, or suppose, according to rule 7, if you invested money, that pays you 12.5% per year. This could be maybe you have invested in the stock market. Then that means, according to the rule of growth, your money will double in 70 divided by the growth rate, which is 12.5. Okay. So 70 divided by 12.5 divided by 12.5. So it will take 5.6 years for your money that you have invested to double. If you invested $10,000 and every year you are earning 12.5% return on your investment compounded, that means over a period of 5.6 years, your $10,000 will double to $20,000. That's what that means. So we already calculated that. You just take 70 over the growth rate. So let's look at, there are growth miracles and growth disasters, as I talked about. The United States is one of those countries that has been referred to as a growth miracle country. We have had sustained economic growth. That's why we are one of the wealthiest countries on earth. Okay, countries like Japan. Japan used to be very poor up to about 1950s, after World War II. The Japanese economy started growing at like 7.2% every year. Look at how Japan is today in contemporary times. Japan was able to increase economic growth. So that's a growth miracle. Countries like South Korea. The average income of a South Korean in the 1960s, see that? 1950s and 1960s was identical to the average income of Nigeria. That's a country which is still very poor in Africa and yet is very rich in oil. But look at what South Korea broke away. They started doing like, putting in ingredients that can make the economy prosper. Meanwhile, Nigeria continue with corruption, bad governance, civil conflicts and stuff like that. So Nigeria kind of like remains stagnant. That in fact, Nigeria never made any progress. Even in contemporary times, like in the 2000s, the average income of Nigeria remained the same almost as the income in the 1960s. Meanwhile, South Korea now, the average income in South Korea is similar to most of Western European countries. So South Korea has caught up with even Western European nations in terms of average income. Argentina has been a disaster too, because it stayed flat almost for the rest of the period around, starting 1950s. So you would regard Argentina and Nigeria as growth disasters. Meanwhile, South Korea, Japan, and maybe the United States as what? Miracles. So the United States is one of the world's wealthiest countries because it grew slowly, but consistently for more than 200 years. Even though America has been averaging the growth rate of 2%, we were able to sustain that growth for a long period of time. That is what makes us one of the wealthiest countries on earth. For the case of the Japanese, from 1950 to 1970, Japan grew at 8.5% per year. Now it's one of the richest countries in the world. Okay. In 1950s, South Korea had GDP per capita about the same as Nigeria. I mentioned this. But from 1970 to 1990, it grew at a rate of 7.2%. Today, South Korea is on par with many European countries, as I mentioned earlier. So that tells you South Korea is a growth miracle. So are countries like Singapore, Taiwan. So now, as I said, Nigeria has barely grown since 1950. It was poor in 2005 than in 1974. When high, so in 1970s, there was oil price, because Nigeria is part of OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which is this oil cartel. I talked about it in the chapter when I was talking about oil cartel and oligopoly, chapter 17. Chapter 15. But so that gave Nigeria some little bit of boost in the boost in 1970s, because oil prices were high. They were able to accumulate wealth because of oil. But when oil prices fell, 2005, Nigeria actually became poorer than it was in 1974. In 1900, Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world, by the way, with GDP per capita almost as large as that of the United States. But by 1950, Argentina's per capita real GDP had fallen to half of that of the United States. And by 2000, Argentina's average income was less than 1/3 that of the United States. So that tells you that, Argentina is one of those growth disasters out there. And that's also a learning lesson, that your country may start well, being prosperous, but that prosperity can dissipate, that you can actually fall to a point of being less prosperous. Argentina is one of those classic cases. So let's talk about the bad news about the economic growth and income around the world. Most of the world is poor. That is a fact. More than 1 billion people live on incomes of less than $3 per day. I mentioned this earlier. These people have greatly reduced prospects for health. They have reduced prospects for health, happiness, and peace because of poverty. The good news is that despite being a quite recent phenomenon, economic growth has transformed the world. It has raised standard of living of most people in developed nations many times above the historical norm. Understanding the wealth of nations is critical if we are to improve human condition around the world, because there are critical steps that a country needs to follow, some of the key ingredients that a country needs to have for it to attain a higher level of what? Of welfare or economic prosperity. So most of the world, as I said, is relatively poor. The correct choice, we just talked about that. Okay, so let's start breaking it down. The causes of growth in GDP per capita, what makes countries poor and what makes countries wealthy. Okay, so this is going to include factors of production, like a country having technology, abundance of capital stock, physical capital, abundance of human capital and technical knowledge. This is down here. That's what we call factors of production. You need an organization like the entrepreneurship organization in the country. One of the reasons why America is very prosperous, because America has got so many entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs are people who take risk to invest and organize other factors of production, who pull it together, bring labor, capital, land, whatever, and mix them up to produce goods and services. And they also engage in research and development, take risk to engage in research and development. So these factors are so for a country to be successful or to grow, You need physical capital. You need human capital. Human capital is the skill and experience that workers acquire through some formal or informal training. Okay? The skill sets that you have. Like I would argue that you guys are more skilled because you're going to college accumulating skills than your counterparts who might have dropped out of high school. Okay? Because one of the key measures of human capital is the average number of years of schooling. Some people, the economists measure human capital and compare that across countries in different ways. The simplest one is they look at just the average number of years of schooling. Some countries, the average number of years of schooling is only like 15 or 12. Meanwhile, some countries, the average years of schooling could be 25. So the presumption is that countries with a relatively higher number of years of schooling, where people spend on average many years accumulating skills through formal education, tend to have higher human capital than countries where the average number of years of schooling is very low. And then also for you to grow, there are several other outside factors beyond physical factors of production that are listed here. You need geography is one, and then the history and ideas, culture, and luck. Sometimes you need luck. Luck could be something that a country may find itself discovering some new critical resources that are key to producing goods and services. A country may discover, like country like Norway, they were lucky that Norway discovered that they have huge deposit of oil. And Norway has been able to develop itself partly because of that. They were able to put it together that all the oil revenue, they put in some kind of oil fund, which they use to building infrastructure. That's why Norway is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So that's kind of like, so to some extent, it's luck. There are countries that are there which, you don't find any, there's no natural resource at all. They don't have any critical resources needed to produce goods and services. So they're unlucky. And then sometimes the culture of work, cultural norms in a country can make a country grow or retard. Economic growth can get retarded in a country that with cultural norms are not very good. And then geography is very important. One of the things that geographical location of a country can actually be a crucial ingredient for its prosperity. For example, countries that are located around the ocean, because we know that transportation via the sea is cheaper than transportation via air transportation, and maybe road transportation or rail transportation. So countries that are located, that have got close proximity to the ocean, they are able to ship goods cheaply in and out of the country. So they are able to engage cheaply in a national trade, in a national commerce, than landlocked countries. There are countries that are landlocked that don't have access to the sea. Okay? So transportation cost is a lot higher in those landlocked countries. For them to access markets outside those countries is more expensive than countries that have close proximity to the sea. So geography is a very good determining factor of economic prosperity. And then also you need to have institutions. We're going to break it down. Institutions of government. When I talk about institutions of government, I talk about things like the rule of law, good governance. You need honest government that is not corrupt, that is building infrastructure, not stealing money. You need government that can protect property rights to intellectual property, stuff like that. And then also you need incentives. Sometimes you need some little bit of incentives to boost economic growth. Incentives can come in terms of tax incentives or any other forms of incentives like subsidies. Okay? So all these factors, institutional incentives, geography, and then of course factors of production, are going to lead to what? GDP per capita, higher incomes. Okay? So let's start. So physical capital, which is part of the factors of production, is the stock of tools that include machines, structures, and equipment. Human capital is a productive knowledge and skills. I talk about that. The productive knowledge and skills that workers acquire through education, training, or experience on the job. That's what they call human capital. Okay. So countries with high GDP per capita have a lot of factors of production. When you see like countries like the United States, China, Western European countries, they have large stocks of physical capital. They also have many people with who have attained higher level of schooling, who have accumulated skills. And they also have they are a country with very high technological knowledge, the technical know-how to do things. Most of the innovations or inventions happen in Western world. You know that. And that technological advancement or technological knowledge is critical for economic growth and for a country to be prosperous. And then you also need more and better physical capital that make workers more productive. Human capital enables workers to take advantage of more sophisticated tools. Greater quantities of physical and human capital make workers more productive. And we increase human capital with education. So countries that have got better education systems are likely to have higher levels of human capital, which is critical for economic growth and prosperity. And then I talk about technological knowledge and knowledge about how the world works that is used to produce goods and services is very critical. And technological knowledge comes through innovation, okay? R&D, research and development. So improved technological knowledge increases productivity. It makes workers more productive. Okay? Workers that are using AI, artificial intelligence, or better computers tend to be more productive than companies that are not using what? Artificial intelligence or better machines, better technology. So better technological knowledge allowed the United States farms to increase output 2.5 times since the 1950s while using less land. So farmers in America become more productive on their land than we saw in 1950s because of better farm level technology. We increase technological knowledge with research and development. I talk about that research and development, R&D. And then the organization of factors production depends on incentives and institutions of government. So here's kind of testing your knowledge. So knowledge that is used to produce goods and services is called technological knowledge. We talked about that. Okay. And then institutions, these are the rules of the game that structure economic incentives. And these are some of what we regard as institutions. Institutions include laws and regulations, but also customs or practices that countries have, societies have, organizations and social mores or social norms. Institutions that promote growth create incentives that align self-interest with societal social interests. Wealthy countries have institutions that make it in people's interest to invest in physical capital, human capital, and technological knowledge. That is true. So institutions of economic growth include things like property rights, the rights to, for example, the right to intellectual property. That if you invent something new, maybe say you invent a new drug for treating some terminal illness like cancer, that's the reason why the government is going to issue you what we call a patent right, where you have an exclusive right to produce that drug for the next 20 years. If you write, you write an article, research article, or you write a textbook, they issue you a copyright. Nobody can copy your textbook and claim the ideas are theirs. You have a copyright. You can enjoy selling your books and earning royalty from your book sales for maybe up to 70 years. And then the other thing that we need honest government. It's part of institutions that we're talking about here. You want governments to be less corrupt. And then you want political stability. You don't want a country that is fighting civil conflicts all the time, or political instability, constant takeovers of government through military coups and stuff like that, because that brings instability overall. And then you need a dependable legal system, a legal system that can enforce business contracts. If you enter into a business contract with another company, they should be able to honor the provisions in the contract. If one of the parties to the contract maybe does not follow the obligation, then you have the right to go and sue them in a court of law. So you want a legal system, a court system that is less corrupt, that is fair, and is going to reward you when the other party is found in breach of contract. And then we also need competitive and open markets where we can trade fairly and freely. Okay. So I talk about property rights are important institutions for encouraging investment in human. And I always give this example. I always tell my students that one of my favorite musicians is Lady Gaga. I know a lot of you like Lady Gaga's music. So, or Justin Timberlake is one of my favorite. It's smooth Justin Timberlake. So, or Beyonce, okay, or Jay-Z, good rapper. So if Justin Timberlake was born in a place like Ethiopia, and let's say he came out with his first CD, which is a good innovation, guess what is going to happen to him if he was in Ethiopia, not America? Because Ethiopia does not protect intellectual property. People were going to copy Justin Timberlake's first album, and they're going to copy several and sell it on the street for $1. That's piracy. And the Ethiopian government will not protect JT. But that kind of stuff doesn't happen in America. If you come out with a new album, nobody should steal your album and copy and sell them on the roadside. They go to jail because we prosecute piracy. Or you come out with a new movie and somebody pirates and starts selling your movies overseas or even in the United States for less than the market value. You have the right to prosecute those individuals. So protecting property rights will ensure that people are there's incentive to innovation. If you don't protect property rights like countries like in most countries in Africa, then there's going to be nobody's going to care about innovation anymore because they know it's not worth it. And so under communal property, effort is divorced from payment. So there's incentive to free ride. Communal ownership is where the community or society own a good collectively, collective ownership of resources. Like, back in the days, there used to be what they call a common grazing land in the United Kingdom, where farmers, farmers who own livestock would just go to a place and openly graze their animal. Nobody had ownership to that land. The land was owned by the community. That's what we call communal ownership of property. That is not very good. Property is better owned individually, where everybody has got individual rights to their property. But if you're just owning it as that the community or it's very common in Africa where you find a tribal group. Even here in America, we have the Indian tribes, which collectively own pieces of land in America. Okay, but this is still very common in Africa where the tribal group or a clan own a piece of land collectively. So there's no individual rights to property. Okay, so that can be very problematic. So when China switched from communal to individual farms, food production increased by 50%. Can you believe that? And 170 million people were lifted above the lowest poverty line in China. So when you talk about free rider comes from that communal type of ownership. If you own land communally where nobody takes responsibility, then there are people who want to use that land or use that resource without contributing to the resource upkeep. You're keeping up to the value of land because they don't care. The land is not owned on an individual basis, a communal ownership. Okay, so savers won't save and investors won't invest if they don't expect that they will receive a return for their savings and investment because there's no property rights. And property rights are also important for encouraging technological innovation. I talked about that. If the government doesn't guarantee rights to intellectual property, nobody want to innovate. Companies will not undertake research and development unless they expect a profit from it. So that only comes when you guarantee them a property right. And then I talk about honest government, economic growth. Countries are going to be prosperous if your government is honest. We want less corrupt government that don't steal public funds, where government officials and government bureaucrats are stealing government money for their own interest. Money that should be used to build hospitals, public schools, highways. We see this in poorer countries where, people who are very entrenched in corruption because maybe they're related to the government, the leaders in government, they basically steal with impunity. People are stealing millions of dollars in some of the poorest countries. And at the end of the day, roads don't get built. They're driving their vehicles on some jungle-like unpaved roads. because some politicians or government bureaucrats have what? Stolen the money that they should have used to building those roads. So resources invested in bribing cannot be invested in machinery and equipment. Remember that. If you're a society which is full of bribes, corruption, and then corruption makes it more profitable to be a corrupt politician or bureaucrat, that doesn't end up benefiting anybody in society. Few people want to be entrepreneurs because they know that their wealth will be stolen. So if you have a corrupt society, nobody wants to be an entrepreneur to start a business because you feel like even the people you're going to be employing, your own employees can steal steal from the company. Okay, so that's very dangerous. So some people are going to say, well, it's not worth it to become an entrepreneur and own a business because if there's a very high level of corruption, my employees are going to steal from my business. Okay. Okay. So here are some of the top 10 least corrupt countries and the top 10 most corrupt countries. The top 10 least countries that are the least corrupt in the world include countries like mostly in the West. You can see the United States is not among the least. It's not among the top 10. There's a lot of corruption in America too. So countries like Denmark is the least corrupt country in the world, followed by New Zealand, Finland, Sweden, Switzerland, Norway, Singapore, Netherlands, Canada, and Germany. And then the top 10 most corrupt countries in the world include that Somalia, countries like South Sudan, North Korea, Syria, Yemen, Sudan, Libya, Afghanistan, Guinea-Bissau, Venezuela. See, those are some of the top 10. The economists have found that there's a negative correlation between corruption and economic prosperity measured by average income GDP per capita. So countries that are the most, as the level of corruption increases, which we're measuring on this axis, you can see that the countries like Somalia, which are very corrupt, Afghanistan, average income is very low. So there's a negative correlation between economic prosperity and countries that are corrupt and corruption. The most corrupt countries tend to have lower living standard, lower income. Countries that are at least corrupt, like Luxembourg there, Denmark, maybe United States. Okay, US is not among the top 10, but it's still considered among the top least corrupt countries. Maybe it might make it in the top 20 or top 15. So average income is also high. So the rules, regulations, and customs that structure incentives are called institutions. We just talked about it. We've been discussing that. B is the correct choice. So in many nations, civil war, military dictatorships, and anarchy have destroyed the institutions necessary for economic growth. If you have a dictator who steals most of the public funds for their own self-interest agenda, then the country is bound to fail. Roads are not built. Other critical institutions of government are not built. So prior to 2006, 2 Liberian presidents used force to eradicate their opposition for 35 years. Okay? Think about that. You guys heard about Charles Taylor. A good legal system facilitates contracts and protects private parties from expropriating one another. That's right. If you have a good legal system that enforces contracts, then 2 companies that enter into a legal contract, one they're going to have no incentive to cheat, because they know that if one cheats and doesn't abide by the terms of the contract, they're going to get sued and there are going to be penalties. And then poorly protected property rights can stem from either too much or too little government. And then some legal systems are of such low quality that no one knows for certain who owns what. That's how bad it is in some developing countries. And it's difficult to borrow money if lenders aren't sure they will get their money back. That's the problem. And about half the differences in per capita income accrue in countries, okay, across countries are explained by differences in the amount of physical and human capital. So that, in other words, countries that have got the highest amount of human capital and more physical capital tend to have more average income. About a half the difference in per capita income is explained by those two factors. The other half of the difference are explained by the failure to use capital efficiently. Competitive and open markets are one of the best ways to encourage efficient organization of resources, like open markets like the United States. Some reasons for inefficient organization include inefficient and unnecessary regulations, red tape, or the time and cost to do tasks such as starting a business. Can you believe in certain countries, it might take you 6 months to just move your paperwork to register a business? Some take up to 2 years. If you don't bribe somebody along the way, they will never move your paperwork for you to get a certificate of registration of your company. So that's how bad things are in some countries. And in countries that have barriers to free trade, free international trade, tend to have lower standard of living. Economies of scale, these are the advantages of large-scale production that reduce average cost as quantity increases. Okay, and this is going to happen in countries that are more open society, open markets. Okay, the countries are going to enjoy economies of scale. So, and then there are other things, causes of economic prosperity too, like natural resources may help explain why a country is able to accumulate physical and human capital. So countries that are relatively more endowed with natural resource goods like oil, gold, copper, diamonds, lithium, zinc, cobalt, uranium, those critical minerals or natural resource goods. If those resources are used effectively, it can help to boost human capital and physical capital. But if it's not used effectively, it could lead what I do into I do a lot of research on this topic. It can lead into what we call a natural resource curse. That countries that tend to have very high amount of natural resources may not actually take off. Like a classic example is Nigeria. This country has been the 4th largest crude oil exporter to the United States since the 1960s. And yet it's still one of the poorest countries in the world. So that's what we call a natural resource curse. If those natural resources are not used effectively, corruption creeps in, then it can actually be more disastrous for a country. But if you use well, like countries like Norway, that we have been able to effectively use their natural resource oil, then Norway is able to build more human capital and physical capital. And then I say transportation is cheaper over water. So geography can determine whether a country is going to be poor or not. We say that because transportation is cheaper over water than over land, so that means countries that have got easy access or close proximity to water or to the ocean, okay, are able to ship goods in and out of the country cheaply than landlocked countries that don't have any proximity to a major seaport. Okay, so landlocked countries have lower per capita GDP than countries with access to the coast. So history, ideas, geography, culture, and luck are also important to economic growth. So that's kind of like some of the key talking points of some of the key ingredients. What are the things that a country need to have economic growth or to have economic prosperity? So it ranges from institutional factors, incentives, and to factors of production like physical capital, human capital, and organizational structure. Okay. So here are the takeaways, which are just basically the summary of these short topics. And again, this concludes chapter 27. So again, the recording of this chapter will be converted into a permanent YouTube link. Yes, it's going to be converted into a permanent YouTube link, which will be shared at Canvas. Thank you very much. I'm going to be recording more chapters soon. Bye-bye for now.